Okay, just to start off with a few minutes of cultural interaction. All right, so that was a short look at what French 1970s singers were like. And actually, Christophe died not long ago. Not the COVID, but he died a few months ago. Oops, I made a mistake. Close, wait. And so that's a very, very famous song in France, just like the one you were listening to just before, Jean-Jacques Goldman. All right. So back on track, and again, compliance. We're in the middle of compliance. If I remember correctly, we had started the compliance revolution, if I'm not mistaken, if that is right. And we had looked at the traditional and the new compliance aspect, and I want to pick up on that. So what we're going to do today, we're going to do 2 or 3 things. First, we're going to finish off a general outlook regarding compliance. Will then be, because we'll be linking compliance and ethics together, and that is something that we'll be looking at, through some cases, and for that we'll be watching these very short movies about ethical situation or ethical dilemmas and difficulties. These movies were made by the Hong Kong supervisory financial services regulatory authority. So it's interesting because it also has a different way of presenting things than, for example, we would do in other parts of the world. And that will enable us to move on starting tomorrow on some of the cases. So I'll tell you which one to look for tomorrow and Friday, and corporate governance. That will be mixing both of those. All right, so that's what we're going to be doing today. And once again, I know, yeah, I was forgetting. And of course, we will take a few minutes at one point to maybe talk a bit about Alex Edmans' talk about social responsibility within companies. And I'll ask you a few questions, see how you understood that, what you make of that. It's a very interesting. Actually, I think it's a very compelling speech, and it's a very interesting subject that he addressed. And you will see why there's a direct relationship regarding the compliance. We're going to look at the general model of evolution of compliance and regulation, and you will see that when we start talking about the social responsibility and the corporate social responsibility, or the way you should think about your business and your business model in today's world, things have changed. And actually, the development of compliance, ethics that falls within the compliance model of organizing your activities, and this larger picture about the role of businesses and organizations, even private organization, even for-profit organization in today's world, and the impact that it has, is not just an academic talk. It's not just small philosophy that you can have a nice beer, you have a Saigon beer or a Hanoi beer, and you talk about how the world could be. It's more than that. It's much more than that, because it is about the ongoing transformation of how people see themselves in business, and how people are ready, how they can accept the development of business. So I think this is an important aspect, because this is the world that you're living in, and this is the business world that you will be confronted with different type of issues. Now, of course, we should not be naive. Okay, business is business, right? and you can try to do good. You can try to, I don't know, to have processes, for example, that limit your environmental, your climate impact. Okay, you can thrive to accomplish that, but business will remain business, negotiation will remain negotiation, and so we should not be naive about the ideals that we try to embed in the activities through compliance and the ethical framework of compliance, and the reality of markets. Markets are markets, and it's a tough game out there. It's a wild game, and you know that very well. All right, so so that's why, just finishing on that point, that's why Alex Edmans' talk is interesting, because he doesn't approach corporate social responsibility in a naive, candid way. He looks at it as a business element and as a comparative advantage, a bit like Adam Smith used to talk about comparative advantages of organizations. All right, so if you remember, we looked at, sorry, moving up the presentation. We looked at what is compliance, what does it mean, and we have a first basic understanding of compliance, that it is a set of process, but we have to be careful that the word compliance can be used at different level. All right, it can be used in a very general way to comply with something, and then you comply with rules, but it also refers to a self regulated system that you put in and you embed within your organization. So the way we're going to be talking about compliance from now on is only focusing at the firm level on how you organize your activities within the firm. It's not just about complying with rules and regulation or ethics. Okay? It's more precisely addressing the questions of organization, basically. But we talked about, and that's all. That's also what's behind new compliance. The new compliance is adding on the traditional compliance, which was a very technical approach to am I meeting the standards and things like that. New compliance is more than that. It's a larger view, and this is where we had stopped, if I remember correctly, and we're going to try to understand what it implies. Okay, now if you remember, we had shown that new compliance is linked to strategy, and it's about judgment-based practices. What this means, and you have to understand that because it's important, what this means is that there was a shift from what we call a rules, I don't know if you can hear, but it's raining a lot in Paris. A rules-based approach, which is an approach where you only focus on the formal rules, applications of the formal rules. A rules-based approach is traditionally the way law is understood. Remember, we talked about that in the first or the second session. It's quite the civil law tradition. Okay, in civil law systems versus common law systems, we have a rules-based approach. I mean, we look at the rules and we follow the rules. And usually rules are pretty extensive because they try to address all the issues that you might meet. Now, this is different from what is called a principle, or a principle-based approach. In a principle-based approach, we could also talk about an outcomes-focused approach. Instead of relying on specific rules and sets of rules that you have to follow, we are actually laying down principles that have to be respected. And so the judgment-based practice is directly linked to a principle-based approach, because instead of telling you, you have to do this, you need to have a 2 centimeter nail on that shelf. We're telling you, you need to have shelves, okay, where you put books that will resist an earthquake. Okay, so it's a principle. We're not telling you how to do it with a rule. We're telling you what are the principles that you should put in practice, but then it's up to you to seize those principles and to actually apply them in a, let's say, well-designed manner that fits your organization, that fits your situation. So you see, the principle-based approach takes you on judgment-based practice, because you have to judge, and nobody's holding your hand. You have to judge what will be the best organization to meet the requirements of those principles. So that, I think that's really the shift and the change in compliance, and the reason also why ethics is now playing an important part of it. Okay, and that's why we say that new compliance encompasses, so it covers, it blends in. It's a way of doing things, way of seeing things. It blends in ethics, culture and conduct risk, good governance, and its outcomes focus. I will come back on that right in a few minutes. Now, another important thing to understand about this new compliance, what this means, this new set of compliance. Well, one of the important things to understand is that it implies what we can call a shared journey. This is important. It might not seem obvious, okay, at first sight, but I'll explain. To be efficient, it is important that the journey to new compliance and the implementation of new compliance is a shared one, and it is shared with two different actors. One is a theoretical one, the other one is an organization. It is important that new compliance embarks on a journey that is shared with regulation. Okay. If there's a mismatch, if there's a separation from regulations, the rules, and the regulatory framework that you operate within, and compliance, then you can have what would be called, catching up situation. Those are the situation when one side is always playing catch up, trying to catch up. So if regulation, and that creates a risk. It creates a risk, a reputational risk for the firm, an efficiency risk also in terms of applying the regulation. So if regulation is ahead of compliance, okay, if the rules that are written down, if your regulatory framework is ahead of compliance, the firms, the companies, firms themselves, they may be subject to increased regulatory risk, right? Because if my compliance is lagging, is behind the regulation, then I have a regulatory risk. I might be in breach of a regulatory requirement. And if, on the other hand, compliance goes ahead of regulation, if my compliance processes take me further down the road than the regulation, the risk is it is unexpected interpretation by the regulatory authorities, by the regulators, which will, here again, increase regulatory firm risk. And regulators in that situation, when there's regulatory misinterpretation, they might suffer reputational damage and loss of support from the business community. What I mean by this is that if you operate in an environment where your compliance is ahead of regulation and the regulator, so I don't know, for example, the French AMF, Autorité des Marchés Financiers, the American SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the British FCA today, the Financial Conduct Authority, if they are lagging behind and they misinterpret, they will lose their reputation on the people, on the business community that they are supposed to be overseeing, monitoring, and setting up the norms. And if that happens, then you have a problem, because one of the pillar of the regulatory framework, remember those pillar in financial services, it's laws and an agency, and it's together that this functions. So in the case of having advanced compliance and catching up a regulation, then the regulator might fail. Okay, he might fail, and he might not be able to deliver what he's supposed to deliver, just because he's going to lose the reputation and the support from the business community. And one of the specific things about the agency model, okay, the agency regulatory model, remember I had insisted on that. It's that it is a model that is more of a partnership model or collaborative model, where there is a dialogue between the business community and the economic operators that you are monitoring, that you're overseeing, and the regulator. And that's a great difference from the traditional hierarchical approach where you have the state and its administration that top-down fix rules. Okay. And I'm sure that in Vietnam, like in France, there are lots of very common jokes about how the administration is never efficient, how they're always lagging behind, they're not modern enough, and things like that. Which has a consequence, is that we are less respectful of the administration. And so this carries what we call a transaction cost. Okay, and it's actually it's a lose-lose game and not a win-win in this case, because it's not good for anybody that there's an imbalance in the organization and the functioning of the framework and the regulatory framework. Okay, so that's one of the important elements that I want to insist on. It's a shared journey, compliance and regulation. They have to move together forward. The other aspect of the shared journey, this time it's not with regulation, it's with the regulators themselves. To that extent, I think it's very important to imagine that there's a collaborative approach that is gradually emerging. And it's not a collaborative approach just for the sake of collaboration. It's not because it's nicer to collaborate rather than to fight, which is, by the way, but you can understand that some people maybe are less collaborative than others. So it's not collaboration for collaboration. It's simply because collaboration between the economic operators and the regulators actually brings forward what we call implementation efficiency. So here it's a win-win game. You have more to gain from collaboration with a regulator, even if you disagree with them. Okay, you can disagree on interpretation of rules, on how to do things, but you should do it in a collaborative approach and not in a confrontational approach. We're not in a trench war, okay? I'm not taking out my machine gun against the regulator and the regulator throwing back bombs at me. That's not efficient, because that has a cost. It has an efficiency cost. And so the shared journey should also be between the economic operators, the firms, and the regulatory agencies. And I think this is important, once again, because it has a very rational justification, which is implementation efficiency. And it goes both ways, it goes both ways. If there's collaboration, then the interpretation by the regulatory authority will evolve, will be probably more better adapted to the situation that firms are confronted with. Okay, so I think this is an important aspect. More generally speaking, so not only is it rationally justified, but it is also ideologically justified. Why? Because regulation's role, whether we're talking about the rules written by the legislator or by the actions taken by the regulatory authority, regulation's role is to reflect and to mediate the expectation and requirement of the wider public, okay, of all the community, society, and economic, okay, and of course the economic constraint and models should be reflected and mediated by the role of regulation. So this means that regulatory objectives are rarely unreasonable. Okay, regulatory objectives, although firms tend to think that they are, because each time there's a rule or regulation, they think that it's unreasonable. But in reality, when you think about how the regulatory objectives are set and what they're targeting, and you think of the need of the wider public, of society, and of the economy, you realize that they're rarely unreasonable. But what is quite frequent is that regulators, and here it's true of the legislator and of the agencies, regulators, they often lack the practical business experience to know how to implement those objectives, those regulatory objectives, effectively and in a balanced way. So that's why the agency model also was created. Or actually, that's why the agency model emerged as an efficient model. Why? Because remember what we said, within agencies, you're going to have people that come from business. You're not only having people that come from the public side, the state side. So this is an important aspect. Conversely, why is this collaboration also effective? Because regulatory objectives need to know about the reality of the business in order to regulate it efficiently. But conversely, look at it the other way around. Compliance, if it should have the hands-on experience, it is more distant, because compliance, remember, I'm talking here about compliance at the firm level. Compliance, or firm compliance, will be a bit more distant from the policy agenda, or the what we would call the democratic public needs. The private organization that is a business that has compliance at the firm level doesn't have in its hand the steering wheel of the policy agenda or the general needs. And so obviously you need a dynamic process here. You need a dynamic process because the private interest of a company cannot shoulder and actually decide of the general interest. And so that's why you need the balance. On the one hand, the regulators that have this policy agenda in mind, and that do represent and make choices regarding the larger community and then society, they need to know what's happening on the field. And on the other hand, the firms on the field cannot decide about the general objectives of public policy. And it's not that they cannot, in terms of they are unable or they do not have the competencies, it's just that it's not their role. The role of a private organization is to defend its private interest, not the general interest. Otherwise, there's a confusion of position. And so that's why this collaborative approach is obviously justified today. And once again, not for ideal reasons, but for very practical reasons. This dynamic, this collaborative approach is essential. Why? Because it triggers a dynamic process of learning from each other, which would be ideal. In an ideal world, that's how it happens. So there's a dynamic process of learning from each other, the regulatory agencies and the economic operator. And in order to do this, you need some kind of facilitative infrastructures. You need a basis of trust, of common trust, and you need extensive practices to move forward. Why? Because a shared journey is about building mutual understanding. And so how did you get along doing that? And this is something that has been done extensively, for example, in France, in the EU over the past few years. Well, shared training vehicles, having common conferences, okay, that are set up by the regulators or by the operators where they meet. Okay, so shared training vehicles, informal discussion groups. The way that the French and the EU regulator functions is through a lot of discussion groups that are set up with the interested parties in order to exchange views, to consult, to see the different ideas and the different constraints before deciding on a policy. Okay. So informal discussion groups. And why informal? Well, it's informal, just like when I talked about the G20, the informal context makes it easier for people to talk because you're going to talk more freely. That's why these informal discussion groups have been really looked upon. Frequent communication of documents, disclosure or transparency. This is something that has been done extensively in the EU, in the US also. Extensive disclosure of documents. I mean, working papers, policy papers, things like that. Of course, that is more often the national regulatory agency that does it, but not only. Think about all the reports that are carried out by firms, by private firms, or by association of private firms. And these reports, they might have bias, because of course, if I'm the professional association of I don't know, of the consumer banks, obviously I'm going to defend my model, but I'm going to do it in such a way, because I have to justify it. So I'm going to bring forward information, and that is what we're trying to achieve here when we talk about frequent communication of documents, about sharing information. And so this is something that's important. And finally, there's a last thread that has also been used here in order to really bring up very practically a collaborative approach through to go down this shared journey, what we call staff exchange programs. For example, within the French Financial Services Authority, it is quite frequent that people from business, from the economic operator, will spend some time at within the regulatory organization. And on the other hand, you also have people from those more public bodies, because regulatory agencies are public bodies, that will spend some time within private organizations. So the staff exchange programs really tries to make sure that there's a very much enhanced mutual understanding of the situation. But I think this is important to understand, because it really is an important aspect of this new compliance. Okay, new compliance is about principle-based approach. Okay, and judgment made practices. It's about moving towards a strategic thinking and not just a technical, mechanical box-ticking approach. And it's about this shared journey that gets everybody to realize that they are on the same boat. And so it's not confronting, as it is sometimes perceived. It is really as moving together. And so the shared journey means that you have to engage and you have to invest in research, education, and discussion with all the stakeholders, the regulatory agencies and the economic operator. It's easier said than done, of course. All right, so this brings us to what I'd like to present, the general model of regulatory and compliance development. Now, why do we talk about a general model, and why a model? And I'll explain this more in detail. Why a model? Think about Darwin's evolutions of species model that tried he modelized the evolution of species through a general model, and it was the evolution of species and the principles of competition and natural selection. If you think about Adam Smith, in the same way, he provided us, a long time ago, 1776, but he provided us with a general model of economic development that is still to an extent relevant. And it is relevant as a model, not as explaining what's happening, but understanding what is happening. And so Adam Smith, he provided us with a general model of economic development, and he described with that model the operation of comparative advantage. Right? So development models, and that is why here we have this model to explain regulation compliance development, is because there are two basic components in a model. It's, first of all, an overall direction and stages of development. All right, so it has a descriptive function and processes underlying changes. And this is where you have the dynamic aspect of models. It helps you grasp and understand the underlying processes and why they bring change. And so we need here a general model of development of regulation and compliance to see their major change, and an explanation of the processes by which these change occurs, because this is what enables us to make choices and take action. So here we have a general model that is proposed to explain, or to help explain, why what was the pathway of change, what was the direction taken, and to uncover the process that have been the drivers of these development. And this can help us do something very simple. And well, no, I'll say it different. This can help us in doing something very difficult, simple to say, and essential to look into. It's to get a clearer view of the future. And that's complicated. That's complicated because we none of us can look into the future. But we need to have a clearer view of the future, because as a business person today, I'm going to make choices. I'll make decisions that will have an impact on my organization, on my practices in the future. Okay, and that can jeopardize my operations, or that can, on the other hand, make it thrive and develop. And so this need of having a clear view of the future is important, and it can only be achieved through, well, looking at the past and understanding what happened in the past that brought us to a certain situation today. So that's the reason of a model. Of course, I'll just very quickly give the usual caveats about models, because they apply here. Models are just models, okay? The model, of course, is quite general. And so there are a lot of variations in the fine-tuning of details. They are different cultures and jurisdictions that will develop at different rates. There are also the fact that progress is not linear, okay? It can go up and down, all right? It can regress. And of course, models are oversimplifications of reality. Okay, so that's an important caveat, and we must not forget it. Okay, models are not the reality. Models are not the explanation of the complexity of the reality, but they provide an easily comprehensible picture that we can then recomplicate by putting in more elements. So and adding the variables to do two things. First, to try to capture reality or understand reality, and secondly, to apply it to our own situations and circumstances. So to say it differently, a model gives us vision of a way of summarizing the past and helping us dealing with future uncertainties. And this is what we need here in terms of compliance. We need to really understand where it has come from. We've started doing that, and think about a map for its future progress and development, because as a business people, that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to be applying, making decisions today in terms of compliance that will trace the future. So the general model of regulatory and compliance development that you have there on the screen with its 5 stages of development is simply a description of a process of maturity, okay? When we start here, compliance and regulation is not mature at all, and when we get here, we're reaching a higher level of maturity of the couple formed by regulation and compliance. So that's what it is, okay? It shows in 5 steps how we can, it helps us understand how things happen, and it gives us some element for a roadmap to its future and for future growth. This model, of course, this is also important, can be applied using different scopes. Why? Because I can apply this model here of general, regulation. Sorry, I can apply this general model of regulation compliance development. I can apply it looking at the jurisdiction level. Okay, the jurisdiction level. Vietnam, for example. Okay, what was the development? What was the process of development of regulation compliance in Vietnam? So at the jurisdiction level, or I can do it for France or for the EU. Okay, so I can apply it at that level, which is basically a macro level. But that same model can also be applied to sectors or subsectors. Okay, I can apply my general model at a sector or subsector level. For example, what has been the stages of development of regulation compliance in the banking industry, for example, or in the financial services industry, which is a bit larger because the financial services would encompass banking, investment services, and insurance. Or I can say, well, what was that development only in the insurance sector? So I can also apply the same model at the sector or subsector level. And finally, that same model, which is, remember, an explanatory descriptive model of a dynamic process that can help you anticipate future development, I can also apply it this time with a micro approach, okay, a microeconomic approach at the firm level, okay? Where does my firm stand in terms of the development of regulation and compliance? So that's more to understand. Now, of course, in real life, there are very different ranges of maturity in the sense that I'll explain this a bit more in detail right now. Imagine that I'm applying my model here, this model of this 5 stage of regulation, to the financial regulation in France. It is obvious that there will be a unique maturity because I'm looking at the general framework. But if I'm looking at the stages of regulation, of financial services regulation and compliance, and then I apply my model to different subsectors, the banking, the investment services, and the insurance, there might be different maturities. I mean, maybe banks and the development of regulation and compliance in banks is further ahead than it is in investment services or insurance. So there can be a range of maturities. And if I'm looking at the micro level, at the firm level, it's obvious that here again, I can have in the same market, I can have different maturities of firms along these 5 stages of development of regulation. And that's an important element to have in mind, is that there will be a range of maturities of individual firms or subsectors, and this causes in itself interesting problems, both for the ones that are still behind and for the regulators that are concerned, the authorities though, right? So in itself, the fact that there will be a range of maturity, not at the macro level, because at the macro level, there cannot be ranges of maturity. Although if I take the EU, you could have because you could have countries, member states, sorry, not just countries, member states that are not yet well, or that are not at the same level of development in terms of regulation and compliance as would be the EU, the overall EU framework. But then that's less of a problem of management. It's more of a legal problem, and I'm not going to go into that because it doesn't concern our subject directly. But the fact that there are ranges of maturity, and that is quite frequent, it's when you apply the model at the firm level or at the subsector level, okay? And then it highlights problems that in themselves are interesting for the regulators. So if we try to explain this model, five stages. First of all, how should we read the model? Well, the first element is that these 5 stages, startup, crisis, expansion, sustainability, outcomes-led, these 5 stages are clearly not mutually exclusive. It's just the opposite. They blend one into another, okay? Each of these stages builds upon the former stage, okay? I go from startup to crisis. That doesn't mean that I erase all the elements of the startup level. Remember what I said about new compliance. New compliance is grounded on, could call old compliance, or the more technical aspect. It did not get rid of that. It's just building on that, okay? It needs a foundational level that it finds there. So that's a first element of reading this model and these charts, is that we're not talking about mutually exclusive stages of development. Let's start by startup. Okay, so here you have the increase of effectiveness and maturity, and this chart shows the relation between effectiveness and maturity, and this is in terms of increase. So, by the way, this is a theoretical model. Okay, I mean, this chart that you see on the screen is theoretical. It's not applied to a given jurisdiction or firm or anything. It's just a general model, and then we could apply it to a more specific real life situation. Startup stage. Okay, first the startup stage. Within the startup stage, you will be establishing credibility by using very direct, often simple, and easy to implement measures to combat an obvious and commonly agreed problem. Okay, I don't know. We have a problem in assessing, and of course, I'm as you know, I'm remaining in the financial sector. This is the MABF. Let's take a simple agreed problem that we have. Let's say I'll give you 2 examples. One at the jurisdictional level, one at the firm level. At the jurisdiction level, let's say that the regulators identify a problem is that there are too many people subscribing to loans, consumer loans, that are too expensive for them, okay? And so that's a social problem that we have, is that you have an increasingly portion of your population that is heavily indebted, okay? And heavily in debt, and that is causing social difficulties. And so I'm going to ask for firms, and I might be putting caps on the amount that can be lended, or I can decide that I'm going to impose a specific risk assessment approach, and I'm clearly going to say if you reach a certain level in that risk assessment grid, then you're not allowed to lend money. Okay, so I'm going to try to use direct, easy to implement measures to address an obvious and generally agreed problem. Same thing would happen in the firm. Let's say that in a firm, let's say that in a firm, you realize that, well, there are too many people that are, let's say, open to corruption. I'm not talking about large state corruption, but just, common corruption. So you have too many people that are easily accepting gifts, and so that are much more lenient about the risk screening of the clients. And that's a simple problem, and it will be agreed upon at the board level, where you'll say, well, wait a minute, we have a problem because we have an increasing exposure to risk, and one of the reasons is probably because the processes that we've implemented enable the employees to be subject to pressure. And so here I'm going to adopt very simple, easy to implement measures to combat what is a commonly agreed problem of petty corruption, as we call it, or influence. And so I'm going to set rules in order to avoid that. Now, at this stage, enforcement, and you see through these two examples, enforcement are often punitive. Okay, simple measures, a simple instrument, a rule, a limitation, and if you cross the line, bang, you get sanctioned. Okay, so enforcement at this stage is often punitive, and the rules and the breaches of the rules are usually described in very technical terms. Okay. Now, regulation here may operate in an apparently business-friendly way and may be thought by self-regulatory organizations that are very close to the issues and that allow what we call governance by peers. This stage may offer, okay, the startup stage, at this stage we're here, may offer perfectly adequate protection for some societies, for some firms, and it can be a rational place to stay at this startup level for some times. Okay, but regulators' credibility and the effectiveness of both the regulation and the compliance will be undermined when a crisis arrives. Okay, when a crisis emerges, then if you stay at this level, then your effectiveness doesn't deliver much. Okay, because there will be the regulatory framework credibility that will be debated and contested. So that brings us to the second stage, crisis. Here, what usually happens, and we've had a very good example with the 2008 financial crisis. Okay, by the way, sometimes the 2008 crisis didn't really have a name, although we talk, for example, for the 1929 crisis, we talk about the Great Depression. The 2008 crisis is usually referred to as the 2008 financial crisis. But sometimes in the English-speaking world, in the UK or in the US, you hear people talk about the 2008 GFC, the 2008 global financial crisis. Okay, so sometimes people will refer to it, and mainly economists or managers will refer to it as the global financial crisis. All right, so please do not be surprised by that. So this was a good recent example of a crisis. And what characterizes crisis, the stage at this level, what characterizes crisis is that usually you have a reactive and often disorganized or disproportional response to emergent problems. Remember what I just said about the startup level. Here you have common agreed problems, and you come up with easy to implement measures. At the crisis level, what you witness are emerging problems that are new, problems you're not familiar with. And so that triggers, by the regulatory framework, so both the rules, the regulation, and the regulatory authority, it triggers first of all, it puts them in a reactive position, and not a proactive, but a reactive position, and often disorganized and or disproportional response. So two emergent problems. The crisis might also be the consequence of an earlier intervention, okay? And let me explain this. An earlier intervention, maybe the regulation and the regulatory agencies took a position at one point, and that created a crisis, right? And so the problem is new. I thought I was addressing a problem, and I actually created a new problem, a new difficulty. So we've had examples with that. The difficulty was to be a bit more practical. The difficulty, the crisis that would come out, or that could be what we would call the unexpected consequences of an earlier intervention. I'll give you one example. During the 2008 global financial crisis, we realized that one of the problems was that these huge investors, the pension funds, invested heavily in CDOs, okay, collateral debt obligation, collateralized instruments, that were AAAs, okay, that were rated AAAs. And because they were rated AAAs, they did not carry out a very, very strict and important risk assessment. And the reason why they were AAAs were because the pension funds, they actually manage and handle assets that are used to pay pensions. So it's a very sensitive issue. And so they are constrained to very strict rules in terms of measuring the risk, of containing the risk that they are taking, because they have, on the one hand, to have sufficient revenue to pay off the pensions in the future to hundreds of thousands of employees, or millions, but at the same time, they have to be very careful as not to jeopardize, to put at risk the assets that enable to generate those revenues. And so the AAA requirement was something that was thought by regulators as a secured approach, because it was forcing the pension funds to invest in financial instrument that had a good rating, so that were less risky, okay? But the unexpected consequence was that for the originators of CDOs, the one that were packaging CDOs and putting them on the market, okay, the business banks, the investment banks, as we call them in English, the investment banks, they were keen on getting AAA, so they were forcing the credit rating agencies to attribute a AAA rating to their financial instrument, the CDOs, because otherwise, if that was not the case, they knew that they could not sell those CDOs to those actors, the pension funds. All right, so that's an example of an unexpected consequence of an earlier intervention that causes a crisis, and that shows that your response, your regulatory response, was not adequate. Now, changes are often driven by public opinion and political necessity that quite often sees extra regulation, added layers of compliance as necessary, as the only credible quick fix approach. And we saw that during after the 2008 financial crisis. Remember, I talked about all the different reports that came up, and all the new regulations that were adopted, or improvement of existing regulation. Now, The crisis is then quite often, okay, in those cases, when you get here, the crisis has two consequences. First, it shows that your startup level is not sufficient anymore. Okay, you have to move away from it because it is not enabling you to deal with the crisis. And the other consequence is that the crisis will trigger a secondary wave of reform that will involve the rationalization of regulatory and compliance structure. This is what happened with crisis, is that you realize that your first level is not, well, I mean, it worked for a while, but then it hit a wall, it hit a crisis, and you have to change it. And so you need to rationalize both your regulatory approach, so rules, regulations, and the regulatory agencies functioning or approaches, and the compliance structures, the approach to compliance. Now, societies can be confronted to crisis at different stage, not only just after a startup, but usually it's because you have a crisis that you move away from the startup level. Okay, and crisis. So the good side about crisis, because there is a good side. In all bad things, some good can come out, as we say. Or at least you should try to have that philosophy. Has nothing to do with Confucianism or Hinduism or Christianity or Islam or anything. It's just a basic, I would say, philosophical thought about how life moves forward. So the good thing that comes out of these crises is that usually crisis conditions, they can be the cause of progress. They are the cause of progress. Okay. Now, of course, because anytime in your development path you can meet a crisis. Crisis can also be a cause to retreat down. Okay, down the curve. Okay, maybe you're up here at expansion into the crisis, and you come back down here. Okay, but once again, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because usually this triggers changes, and we can only hope that each time these changes are for the better. Anyway, so crises come up, and they play an important role in changing, in going from one stage to another. Then we move on to expansion. Here, regulation becomes much more proactive and confident. It is also usually at this point, at expansion, that you have clearer objectives. The policy mix is much clearer. And you have an extension of scope into a more fringe area. So for example, if we're looking at financial services, well, you're not just going to focus on delivering the financial services. You might be looking at you might expand into the insurance business or the mortgage markets or the those kind of requirements. Okay, so there's an extension of scope into what we call fringe areas. So you're not only regulating the core elements and the firms that deliver the relevant services. You're going to look at some of the areas that have an impact, but that are on the fringe. Okay. So at the expansion level, you move towards more proactive and confident regulation, clearer objectives. Sorry, and a much more efficient, or at least conscious that it needs to look for efficiency, regulator. Regulation, of course, at this point, at point of expansion, also becomes more expensive, more bureaucratic, much more bureaucratic, and unresponsive under the pressure of size. And so the expansion level of regulation and compliance, and this is a paradox, it actually can bring potentially higher risk. Okay, so this is compounded by resistance and lack of consensus within the industry, And at this point of expansion, the industry is further away, moves away from the regulators. Right? Why? Because you have such an increase also in your activities, because regulation becomes more bureaucratic. Well, there is a lack of consensus with the industry, also because it tackles more complex situations, so it's harder to have a consensus. And so expansion usually is not an area where you want to stay very long, and you want to move towards stage number 4, which is sustainability. Sustainability is the recognition that expansion cannot continue exponentially and forever. Expansion reaches a limit. You move from expansion to sustainability, so from stage 3 to stage 4, when regulatory and compliance toolboxes, okay, the instrument that you use, become more fit for purpose and more sophisticated. All right. The methods of rationalization and performance improvement are going to include new approaches that try to move away from what you have at the expansion level, as I told you, which was bureaucratic approaches and unresponsive to size and specific context. At the sustainability level, you realize that this cannot be sustained. That's why we call it sustainability level. That expansion, you can't, to say it differently, you can't keep pouring new regulations, new compliance requirements on top of each other. Okay, there comes a moment where it's just not possible. And so what you need is you need to move away then towards a regulatory and compliance toolbox that is much more fit for purpose, that will adapt efficiently, and much more sophisticated by ways of consequences, much more sophisticated. So what are the methods of rationalization and performance improvement that you usually find when you're stepping from 3 to 4, from expansion to sustainability? First, risk-focused compliance. Okay, there's more risk-focused compliance at that point. That you shift towards risk-focused compliance. Cost-benefit analysis, what we call CBA, cost-benefit analysis, very important. Principles-based regulation, as I said earlier. This is where it's when you go from expansion to sustainability, you move away from the rule-based to the principle-based regulation. An emphasis also on prevention. What we mean by that is that when you move within the sustainability stage, the sustainability level, when the emphasis is not on sanction anymore, it's on prevention. It's on preventing a problem to appear, from preventing an accident, okay, or avoiding an accident. And so the emphasis on prevention means that you're going to focus on corporate culture. What is the acceptable and how do you assess it? Conduct risk, okay? So focus on corporate culture, focus on ethics. There we see, there's the link, ethics and compliance. And governance, okay? The governance structure, transparency, corporate governance, that we'll see after. So to summarize the 4th stage of sustainability, we can say that the emphasis is going here to shift very significantly from controlling precisely individual internal processes to framing, okay, to giving a frame, a general frame, to framing the internal and external environment around a firm or around a sector in such a way as you increase the likelihood of positive behavior. You see the nuance, you see the difference. We move from what we have from startup to expansion, a sometimes desperate try to control very precisely the individual internal processes. You move away from that, and what you do is you say, well, I'm going to give an architecture of regulation, and with the regulatory agency playing a fundamental role in terms of operator of this framework. I'm going to frame the internal and external environment around the firm or within the sector in such a way as, instead of controlling, I am actually increasing the likelihood of positive behavior. That's why it's principle-based. That also explains why in economics, this is what we call the incentive theory, okay? The incentive theory is that I'm going to move things forward with incentives and not just with sanctions, okay? Technically, legally, incentives and sanctions are not in perfect opposition. Why? Because my incentive system, my incentivization will and can rest upon requirements and sanctions, of course. But it's a shift in focus, because that's not the main point. I'm not looking at rules, sanction. I'm just trying to incentivize. I'm trying to increase the likelihood that people will behave, well, positively. And this is where new compliance and ethics is fundamental, because at the same time, I'm not telling you what is right or wrong. Or to say it differently, I am not telling you precisely what is right or wrong. I am telling you what is right or wrong, but as a principle. Remember what we saw in ethics, as a principle. And so that becomes sustainability. Because what this means also is that if I reach a sustainability level and I have a system that increases the likelihood of positive behavior, then I can link with the outcomes led, then I am actually potentially, and so we're not there yet, nowhere in the world, potentially I am pushing away the potential occurrence of a crisis, okay? Because I'm setting a system that should, in itself, fight off crisis, okay? Or at least mitigate them, make sure that they're not as important. It's a bit like a vaccine, okay? It's a bit like a vaccine. In a vaccine, I'm not talking about the RNA, the new vaccines, but I'm talking about the traditional technique used in vaccine is that you inoculate a healthy body with deactivated germs, so that your body will adapt to an aggression and react. Well, it's exactly how the sustainability, if you can link it with outcomes-led approach, the outcomes-led stage, will function towards crisis. And to finish off on reading this general model, so what is the outcomes-led? What is the outcomes-led stage, which is the last stage? It focuses, the outcomes-led stage focuses on systemic outcomes on the wider economy. Remember, I'm talking here about financial regulation. Okay? So it focuses on the systemic outcomes of my financial regulation on the wider economy and society. And when I say society, I should add today on the wider economy, society, and environment. Okay, the environmental aspect is fundamental. It's becoming more and more fundamental. And by evaluating the impacts of the actions of private firms, of operators, by evaluating impact as part of the regulatory mix, regulation incorporates an understanding of the community purposes of regulation and the effects in social and economic terms that these interventions are trying to create. So say differently, an outcome-based system, okay, an outcomes-based system allows for far more creative methods of compliance and regulation And systems and process are not the goal. I mean, you're not, creating processes and systems because you have to meet the standards, and so you have to. No, the outcome-based systems enables you to have more creative methods of compliance and regulation, because what is looked upon is the impact, is the consequences of your act, not just setting up a system. So this is why it's very important to reach the outcomes led, because it means that your maturity is quite high. But it also means that you need to have tools that move away from this level, from the bureaucratic, expensive aspect of the compliance and the regulation, because otherwise that creates specific avoidance strategies where firms, to avoid the cost, will try to counter, to move around the requirements. So the outcomes-led level also usually has a consequence, is that if it is more effective and it's more principle-based, of course, because that's what you reach at level 4, you can probably employ your regulation for a much wider range of objectives. Your objectives pursued by your regulation can be much more specified and can address different objectives because the tools that you set, the incentives that you set, make it possible to do that. All right. So that's once you reach the last stage, knowing that the difficult step, the most difficult step, is here from 3 to 4. You could actually put a slash here. You could say, you could actually say it's stages 4, 5. Okay, 4 and 5 are more or less together, or they work basically together. But so what's very complicated is actually moving from here to here. Okay, that's the most complicated one. Knowing, once again, I insist, each stage builds on the preceding one. Okay, the crisis response and the regulation and regulatory approach under crisis builds upon the basic regulation and compliance that you had at the startup level. The expansion level, of course, builds upon these 2 first stages. And when you move into sustainability is transforming some of these, but it's upon these that I create my sustainable regulation and compliance model. Okay, so the difficult step is from stage 3 to 4, 5. And this is why you often hear people saying this requires a revolution in commitments, and it requires to increase the depths and the rate of change. The expansion can last some time, but you know that you can't stay there indefinitely, but it can last sometimes. In order to move to sustainability, usually there's a short portion where things accelerate. Otherwise, it doesn't reach the level of sustainability. Okay, so that's the lecture, the understanding of this general model of regulation compliance development. Okay, that's an important understanding. Before looking at an illustration, very quickly, historical illustration of it, I'll be using the UK context. Maybe a few words on the limitations of the model. As I said earlier, any model, any development model has limitation. So some of the limitation that you should have in mind here can be explained by considering a set of questions. First question, for example, and the model doesn't necessarily gives you an answer. Is the lengths of each stage, okay, startup stage, crisis stage, expansion stage, is the length of each stage the same, or can they be shortened? Can they be extended? Of course. Is it the same from, if you're looking at a different country, from one country to another, okay? So is the length of each stage the same? Obviously, the answer is no. The general model is just giving you a model. It's not telling you what are the lengths, okay? So it's not answering that, so that's the limitation of the model. Is it possible to skip a stage entirely? Is it possible to move from one stage to the next, from startup to expansion, without going through crisis? I think it's difficult. It's not impossible, especially in today's world. Remember, that is a globalized world. There's a flow of information, exchange of information that is quite important. So yes, you could probably move quicker through a stage, go much faster on one stage than other countries have, because you're going to benefit from the lessons of others. So I think that's definitely possible. But is it possible to skip a stage entirely? I do not think so. And I'll tell you why. I can think that I'm skipping the crisis because that crisis is less profound, is less violent. But the reason why I'm going from startup to expansion is because I realize that my actual regulation and compliance mix is not effective anymore. And that only comes if there's a certain level of crisis. So my point here is just to say that, well, it's one of the limitations of the model. It doesn't explain, it doesn't tell you what is the exact extent of each phase, not in terms of time, but in terms of content, in terms of depth. And so, is it possible to skip a stage entirely and move from one stage to another? On the face of it, you could think yes, because you might move from startup to expansion without a global financial crisis, without a massive regional crisis. But it is always because, to a certain extent, there is a crisis regarding the effectiveness of the startup level. Okay, so it's one of the limitations of the model. The model doesn't give that explanation, but I would consider that you cannot skip a change. You cannot skip a change entirely, but you can have the feeling sometimes that you're, jumping over a stage. Another question, a third question that expresses the limitation of the model. Is it possible to regress? Is it possible to go backwards, to fall down the slope? Or is, on the other hand, progress irreversible? Once you started, you never stop. I think here the answer is the answer is not given by the model. It's one of the limitations of the model. But if we look empirically at real life, it's possible to regress. Yes, definitely. Is progress irreversible? No, it is not irreversible. And that should remind you something I said when I talked about the legal systems. A legal system is not an endowment. It's not because you've reached a certain sophistication, a certain quality of your legal environment, legal architecture, that it will remain as efficient and it will remain at that level forever. You can regress. You can go back into darkness. That can happen, okay? In the same way that an alcoholic can fall back into alcoholism, you can regress, and progress is not irreversible. So there should be a constant tension here regarding the direction taken. Could you get stuck? Other question that here again shows the limitation, and I'll finish on these last two. Other question that shows the limitations of the model. Can you get stuck in one stage? Could you stay at one level? Well, Yes, I believe you could. I believe you could. You could be stuck at one level. I do not see, though, any system being stuck indefinitely at one level. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. Not only because regulators will always have their eyes on this model, but just because life doesn't function like that. You can't stay stuck. You can stay a long time. So in that sense, you could get stuck, but you can't stay stuck forever at the same level. It's socially and economically impossible just because things are moving around you. Okay, so yes, you can get stuck. You can have a very hard time moving from expansion to sustainability. You can have a hard time moving from crisis response to expansion. All right. But you cannot indefinitely stay at the same level. And finally, and that the model doesn't answer it, and since you're all in finance, you're familiar with that, the question is a final downturn inevitable? Or so once we reach here, will we necessarily do this? Or is this possible? Well, that's the story that has to be written. That's the story that is going to be written by you and others in today and tomorrow. My view, and this is a very personal view, and then we'll have a pause on that. My view is that in today's world, this should be the situation. Why? Because of globalization and because of a greater sense of the complexity of globalization. There was a period where we thought that, globalization in itself was an answer to all the problems. We now know that it's not the case, that globalization can trigger in itself other problems. But we are aware of that. And we are aware wherever we stand, whether we're in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, in Northern America, and Latin America. So there's a common understanding of at least the functioning here of the system, but there's no consensus on what should be done and how. Okay, but that seems to me less problematic than the awareness that we have of the complexity of the issue, because then we are actually devoting more time to this. We are actually being more concerned about the regulation compliance development, because we know that, first of all, it's not a given, and it is complex. And that is why my position, my view is that there are absolutely no reason why we should go down. Okay, we take a downturn. Okay, and it is not inevitable. You know the saying, everything that goes up must come down. And why is it that's true? But for one reason only, gravity. If I can escape gravity, well, hey, I'm not going to come down, right? And so to that extent, we can escape, or we can lower the gravity, the weight of gravity, because of our awareness of the complexity of the situation, of the functioning of real life links between regulation, compliance, and economic development. Okay, so that's so that was this part on how do you read the model, and I hope it enlightens you a bit on this. Before we move on back into ethics, but we'll have a pause first. After the pause, we'll look at an illustration. The illustration is just to see how the general model at the jurisdiction level, UK level, in the UK Financial Services Regulation, how it has, you can actually identify the stages, okay? But I'll be quick on that, but just to give you an illustration. So I didn't take the firm level, I took a jurisdiction level, but it could be done at the firm level, of course. And just, I'll say a few words about about international comparison when we look at this also. Okay, but first let's have a pause. And of course, as always, if you have any questions, come up with them either through the chat or you can even voice them by using the mic. All right, so having said this, 15, 20-minute pause. I know it's getting late. I'll just ask you to bear with me a little longer after, but not too long, okay? So a little break, and I'll see you just after. All right. So where were we? International comparison and illustration of the an illustration of the general model, how it can relate to real life. But as I said, this is at jurisdiction level, okay? Okay. All right. In terms of international comparisons, okay, what I wanted to say, would be to say that we can place along the curve that we saw, we can place regulatory regimes or jurisdiction along the development curve in terms of their stage in the journey, where they are, okay? But you have to understand that even if you have large and powerful regulators in terms of legal powers, in terms of outreach, what they can do, in terms of style of enforcement action, that does not mean that they are sophisticated players in terms of the mix of approaches that are used. And in the same way, this does not mean that these powerful regime are not effective. They might be effective, but they could be more effective if they advanced their methodologies and added to their regulatory toolkit. Why? Well, because what the general model does point at is that compliance will be more embedded and therefore more resilient under pressure if regulators move up the development curve. To say it differently, the development curve regarding the mixed regulation compliance is not something that measures the efficiency of the mix. It shows, and that's where it gives us an idea of the route to take. It focuses on the quality. Sorry, I was looking for my word. The quality of the mix. So to say it differently, the last stages 4 and 5, okay, sustainability and outcomes led, are inherently lower cost because they're more adapted, okay, they fit to the measure, to the situation, and so they're more sustainable in the long term. So I think this is an important aspect, is that the general model is not a model that can tell you your regulatory mix is not good and it's only good if you get there. That's not it. It's that the efficiency, the overall efficiency, and I would say preciseness of your model is about moving through that curve. Okay, so it's a bit different. It's not exactly the same thing. Having said this, maybe one last observation at the international level is that many regulatory compliance systems across the world are not as far along as the curve as they need to be, as they should be, given the challenges they face, and never forget this, the increasing public expectations upon those those systems. And I think this is one of the things that is very clear, at least in the Western world, in today's, especially post COVID-19. This is something, because of the history of industrialized nation, where they stand economically, the increased public expectation is very high on the agenda and is pushing forward a lot of things. And this will partly explain why regulation and compliance have been viewed as less than fully effective during and after the last financial crisis. Now there have been, failures, regulatory failures in other sectors. Okay, I don't know, phone hacking in the UK media that give a general impression that regulation is not always effective. But focusing on financial services, this idea that the regulation and compliance has not been fully effective before 2008 and since then is also partly because of these greater public expectations and the fact that the challenges that we face are probably greater. So even if our regulatory systems seem to be effective, it's actually not enabling us to be quite resilient toward these new challenges. And one of the interesting things about looking at the different models and seeing how things are done is that since regulation is a social activity, the development of one regulatory system tends to drag along the others, tend to be not a model that you will copy and paste, but gives you an idea of what can be done and how you can move forward. So, so that this is an important element for you to have in mind when you look at the different models, or at least it's an important element to have in mind to open your curiosity, or to stimulate your curiosity to look at what others are doing. And when I say others, I'm talking about regulators, regulation, or firms. What firms in other jurisdiction or in other sectors are doing. It's not just looking at what the US are doing. Okay, that's not the point. It's really at looking what can be done in other places. This influence or this drag along effect, and this is a paradox again, also explains why many regulators and tend to be very cautious, because they don't want to be the first movers, because they know that there are many regulators that just do not want to be on the first line. Others, on the other hand, use this as an element of their geopolitical influence. Okay, the US, Europe, definitely, they consider, and the European Union, even more than the US, considers that setting standards is the way forward for the EU. It's our way of doing things, rather than using force and leveraging force. It's really setting standards and justifying the reasons for these standards. Okay, so that's an element that it's very general, but you should have in mind. Now, if we look at a real life situation and we try to see how the general model fits in, well, let's take the UK. The UK, and we will date this 1986, 1992 for the first, and these are very approximative dates. Okay, they're globally or generally taken as referral dates, but they're approximate, of course. We're talking about social events, and so very difficult to give them a very precise dating. And also, since we're talking about social regulation, I mean social activity, so regulation that is a social activity, it is also quite obvious that it's not like a chemical formula. It's not, there was nothing and 1 second after there is something. All this are gradual constructs. Okay, it takes time. It takes diffusion of ideas, that radical ideas that become mainstream or things like that. So it's an ongoing process. You don't just push a button and say I have compliance because I pushed a button. It's more complex. So 1986, 1992. Why 1986 as the starting point? Well, because the 1986 for EU member states, and at that time the UK was a member state. It's not anymore, but it was at that time of the EU. The mid 1980s is when the European Union, that wasn't called the European Union at that time, that doesn't matter. The European Union pushed forward an agenda to modernize financial services. And here I'm talking about financial services altogether. So banking, investment services, and insurance. So modernize financial services in order to create a level playing field in Europe and a single financial area. Okay, an area where financial services could freely cross borders, since we've neutralized the internal borders. And so that explains why 1986. So 1986, 1992, we could say that it's a startup stage. Okay, the stage is startup in the UK. Why? Well, because during that period, we see, and once again, because of the pressure of EU policy, we see the establishment of sectoral self-regulatory organization, SROs, self-regulatory organization, because of deregulation. Now, deregulation, you have to understand the word, what it means precisely. Deregulation is not taking away all regulation. It's not like decarbonization of the economy. It's not like taking all the gas emitting energy out of the policy mix, of the energy mix. Deregulation is, and that's why you have to be careful with that word, deregulation is a different way of regulating. Different in what ways? In the following way, is that before the greater movement of deregulation, the 1980s, at least in the West, there was direct regulation by state and state intervention. Okay, but the world was less global, of course. Deregulation is to reduce the weight of that direct constraint on activities and economic activities, and more specifically in our case, financial activities, by having these self-regulatory organization agencies that will monitor a sector, and that will be in a proactive approach. So it's a different way of regulating. It's not getting rid of all regulation, but it is a way of regulating activities that is considered, and was considered at that time, much more efficient and cost effective than having direct hierarchical, very strict rules. What were the SROs at that time? Well, you had the TSA, the Securities Association, the LOTRO, which is a life assurance and unit trust regulatory organization. FINBRA, which was the Financial Intermediaries, Managers and Brokers Regulatory Authority. FINBRA is the ancestors of the actual FCA, and the Investment Management Regulatory Organization. And all this was within the Securities and Investment Board, SIB. The process rules for transparency, for training and competence, fact-finding, were really, well, first of all, they were simple, but they were focusing on the process. The focus was on the process that you had to set up internally within your activities, within your organization, on fact-finding, transparency, disclosures, training, internal training, competence, etc., etc. So pretty basic measures and simple measures to use. And of course, these were pretty much punitive in the sense that you had to implement those processes, and if you did not, you would be sanctioned. And finally, at that point, the main supervisor of large banks was the Bank of England. 1992, 1998, it's a period of crisis. The period of crisis is less of a global crisis than a crisis that is specific to the UK. So that's why I find that this using the UK as an illustration is interesting, because here, instead of having a crisis that materialized because of a global failure, it is a crisis that came out of different significant failure, but within the normal functioning of the UK economy. Why? You had the BCCI bankruptcy, which was one of the first important shock that a bank, the level, the power of BCCI would go bankrupt. And actually, it was not just a purely UK problem, because the BCCI had subsidiaries all over Europe and even in other parts of the world, and the BCCI's bankruptcy. So it's the dismissal, and it was liquidated. So the demise of the BCCI had rippling effects. Okay, it concerned others than just the UK, and it was a I would say a game changer. All right, the BCCI event and case was a game changer. You had also the Polybec and Mirror pension scheme scandal, which belonged to Maxwell, who was a multimillionaire. He's deceased since then, but he was a sir, and he had a very high reputation. And there was a scandal with the Polybec and Mirror pension schemes, where basically there were some fraudulent activities. And so these two events, the BCCI and the Polybec, they actually raised concern about the corporate governance, about the content of the governance, of course, but also about the quality of the oversight that the Bank of England was carrying on. So about the efficiency of the regulators. And there was another case, which is called the pensions mis-selling and Equitable Life. Equitable Life was an insurance company selling pensions, and the pensions were mis-sold. It means that they were fraudulently put on the market, and that they actually caused a lot of damage to people. And in this case, it's another thing that came out of it, is that the pension mis-selling by Equitable Life, it was considered, rightly or wrongly, and more rightly than wrongly, that the supervisor, the self-regulator, okay, so the LOTRO and the FINBRA, the people that were there to try to prevent from anything going in the wrong direction, actually had not carried out their mission. There had not been efficient supervisors and regulators. And the reason for that was that self-regulators, they came out of this scandal as being too close to industry. So the links were not balanced out. Although I told you that having links with the industry is fundamental for the efficiency of the system, but at that point, it was considered as too close, meaning that the nature of the links prevented the regulator from exercising his mission, that is to monitor and regulate. So that's a crisis. But it's interesting because it's an internal crisis. This will trigger a set of reaction. 1998, 2007, it's the expansion period. And it's the expansion period because of the reactions of the British public authorities because of the crisis that we just mentioned. First of all, they create the FSA, the Financial Services Authority. They adopt what is called, well known as FISMA, which is the Financial Services and Markets Act, in 2000. And that the FSA actually brings together a set of separated and fragmented regulatory bodies that existed prior to the adoption of the FSA. So the Financial Services Authority is a very interesting model, a regulatory model, where it brings together under the same roof different regulators, looking at different markets, different niche, or different types of players. Now, one of the reasons also why this takes place at that period, at least for the FISMA, for the Financial Services and Markets Act, is because there's a new regulation, a major, a very significant change of the EU regulation. So the UK had to adapt. But part of the decisions taken at that time were not just because of the EU's new framework of regulation. It was because of the prior crisis that the UK financial market had experienced. 2007, 2013, sustainability. Now here, there's again, okay, there's a crisis that's going to trigger things. Maybe just to finish on the expansion, I only mentioned the agency, the regulatory body, but if we look at that period, there were also extending the depths for regulation, so increasing the regulation and going further in details regarding that regulation. So that's one of the things we saw in expansion, and the scope, of course, was also enlarged. And a good example of that is it's mentioned here on the slide, the FCA, the Financial Service Authority. The Financial Services Authority's rule book, so the general rules that they decide upon. I'm not talking about the laws that were adopted. I'm talking about the rules of that agency. I mean, became quite burdensome. Why? It went up to 9,500 pages, and I am not talking about commentaries. I am not talking about literature. I'm just talking about the rule book. Okay, just the rules themselves, up to 9,500 pages, which here again was strange because at the same time, the risk-based and the statutory requirement for cost-benefit analysis was increasing, and so that should have reduced the rules-based approach, but it didn't. Another element that took place at that time was the shift towards consumer protection. There was an increasing consumer protection focus, right? So it oriented most of the regulations, and even the compliance approach were influenced by that. 2007, 2013, sustainability. Why can we say that the UK reaches around that time the sustainable level? Well, because it is recognized that there can be a regulatory burden, that the regulatory compliance cost can be counterproductive. It can be counterproductive, it can be costly, and have a discouraging effect, okay? Especially towards foreign firms that will avoid to come to London. I mean, if the cost of your legal requirements is too high, legal and compliance requirements is too high, you're not going to go to such a jurisdiction. So that was one of the concerns that explained why Great Britain went from expansion to sustainability. At the same time, this is where the authorities start to adopt much more principles-based principles-based regulation, okay, moving away from the rule-based. And that will have an impact when you think, because this is really because of the rule-based. The focus moves away from consumer protection into, it doesn't abandon, okay, it doesn't get rid of consumer protection, but it moves away from that. And it looks much more extensively at ethics, culture, and a general principle that will be embedded in general financial EU law. It's the TCF, Treating Customers Fairly rule. Okay, which actually is more than a rule, it's a principle. It's just a principle, because regulation is not telling you what is a fair treatment. It's just telling you you have to have a fair treatment of customers. So TCF. So this is quite a change, and we see what was moving towards sustainability. The 2008 crisis did not stop that; it reinforced those directions. Okay, definitely. And then the last point about sustainability that's worthwhile mentioning is that there was also a much greater use and focus on high-risk sectors and developing regulatory tools and practices, reviews, visits, on-site visits, things like that. At the same time, but then you have to understand that we're in the wake of the crisis, we're in the middle of the crisis. There's also more and more enforcement actions, and an increase in the levels of fines. Now, one of the reasons for that is very simple. It's because since there were more focus on the behavior of firms, there would obviously be more actions, and there were more actions because there had been a financial crisis. Okay, had there not been that financial crisis, we might not have seen a surge in actions, and so such an increase in fines, definitely. And to many observers, since 2013, the UK is in an outcomes-led model, in an outcomes-led situation. So after 2013, the UK's financial services regulation compliance mix is considered to have reached the outcomes-led stage. And there are a few elements that can be mentioned here. First of all, the creation of the FCA. So the FSA disappears in 2013. It becomes the FSA. The change is interesting, very interesting for what we're saying, what we're talking about. The FCA is the Financial Services Authority. The FCA is the Financial Conduct Authority. And this is a very important shift that occurred, is that regulators and agencies have focused from that point on in time, have focused on behavior, on the conduct of the professional players, and not just on the organization and structuring of the products or the marketplace. So this is a real evolution which is important and which is clearly embedded in the change of name. Okay, that's very, very clear. Now the Bank of England still has very relevant and significant banking supervision function, but it's better coordinated with the FCA and with others. And finally, well, when you look at what the FCA publishes, its guidelines, its recommendation, you realize that the FCA concentrates on culture, conduct risk, as we call it, on culture, on governance issues, That's important. I mean, there were cases about money laundering. There were trafficking on the exchange rate of the LIBOR, which is an exchange rate. The LIBOR finance was tampered with, and money laundering, data control issues. A lot of these issues that came up. So the FCA really concentrates on culture and governance issues. And the last thing we could say at this stage, what we also witness is that the UK system sees its supervision of financial players, it sees its supervision becoming much more thematic. Okay, what are your governance process? What's your risk assessment? So thematic and outcomes led. What do you do to address this problem? That's the question that regulators are asking. What do you do to address such and such problem? If you're not concerned with the problem, that's what you'll say. Well, I don't do anything because I'm not concerned with that problem. Okay. As long as it's relevant, not to be concerned with that problem, of course. So that's an example of how in real life, these different stages can be identified, okay? But here again, at the jurisdictional level, so at the British level, not necessarily at the firm level. Okay, so that brings us to a series of elements that I find quite interesting. But okay, before looking at that, very quickly, the compliance and financial regulation, the objectives of financial regulation, okay? The objective of financial regulation that there's a broad consensus today about are these five, okay? Protection of investor, fair markets, efficient and transparent, reduction of systemic risk, financial crime, and favoring consumer confidence. Why is it important to understand that and to identify that? Well, because your regulation compliance mix will be about setting that into practice, okay, making it work, to making it deliver efficiently. So understanding these objectives do play an important role because of that. Now, what are the objectives of compliance? Now we're coming to the technical aspect of compliance. Well, the technical aspect of compliance is obviously what you have to do in practice is to identify the risk that you face and advise on them. The identification phase is interesting because that is what feeds the advisory function of whoever is carrying out the compliance deal. So the advisory function of the compliance approach, which is it's two aspects of the same thing. My compliance processes and approach are initially designated to identify the risk. Okay, so identification. But that is what feeds into my capacity to be an advisor. Second objective of compliance, designation and implementation of controls to protect the organization from the risk that it has identified. Okay? As a prevention phase, or a prevention, not phase, the prevention element. Then to monitor and report on the effectiveness of those controls in the management of the organization's exposure to risk. So that's monitoring and detection. That is fundamental. That is both done by the firms themselves through their compliance process and by the regulator, the outside regulator that will, that can ask for documents, that can visit, that can do a lot of things in order to monitor and detect the effectiveness of the controls. Last 2 points to resolve compliance difficulty as they occur. It's a resolution approach. Yes, it's true. The compliance department or officer is often called upon to resolve compliance difficulties, on a day-to-day basis, as they evolve, as they occur. Sorry, as things happen. It's the resolution aspect. It's not the funniest one, but it's obviously important, and it's playing an important role in today's post-COVID-19 world, where a lot of firms are going to be in tight spots. And finally, to advise the business on rules and controls, the famous advisory function. And the advisory function is very important. It is very important, and it is only possible to the extent that you carry out these steps. All right. All right. Sorry. Okay, I see time is really flying. I'll be very quick on these last slides just to finish off the session. So we won't have time, I don't think so, to look at the to watch the short movies. We'll do that tomorrow. The short movies regarding ethical aspect, because I won't even have time to talk about the embedded ethics in the model. So now that we know, sorry, where's that? That's here. Now that we know what are the objective of compliance and the objective of financial regulation, now we have both. And that we know that the objective of financial regulation functions with a regulator, an independent agency. Then let's look at the compliance methods. The main thing that you should remember is that there is not one method, and there is no one size fit all approach. Okay, that would, whoever's selling you that is actually lying, or not even conscious that he's lying, or that he's not correct. There is not one method. There's not one method, but what we do identify are processes, internal control, monitoring, and disclosure. You probably know, or you have perceived already, that there are probably very active groups in order to bring forward models, solutions, commercial services related to compliance. One of these, it's not a commercial service, but it is still a player in itself. One of these elements set forward is the adoption of the GRC, the Enterprise Governance, Risk, and Compliance. Okay, the risk and compliance within the system, to put that within your organization, and that system. But this is just one among others. I could have chosen another one. It's a technology-based platforms that enable GRC, so that this governance, risk, and compliance approach. Okay, you focus on governance, the risk, and the compliance, and all that fits together. So one company is offering a technology-based platform that enables a sustainable approach. Why? Because you can monitor change continuously at a much lower cost. So that would be the first element, okay? The sustainability, monitoring change continuously. It is consistent in the sense that standards, repeated and aggregated, they take all standards and they aggregate the risk and the compliance data across the organization. So it's not functioning in silos where it's going to look at a risk in one given area of activities, not the others, which is a real problem. It's efficient because it can automate if necessary. It can automate the processes, and it's all about compliance, even if I've told you that new compliance is probably a bit more complex. And finally, it's a system that's transparent. There is a single reporting structure, a central reporting structure, and a central repository, or a single repository. And the repository is where you have all the information, but the legally valuable information. All right, so this has been made possible because of the evolution of technologies. All right, and that's why there's this quotation from McLean and Rasmussen from an article that without technology, business processes, employees, and system behave like leaves in the wind. There's this idea that before the massive use of these technological solutions, the systems had no coordination and were not consistent across one another, different platform. So technology plays an important role, and that is why there are also a lot of debates regarding compliance within the computer science industry, and more specifically within the computer sciences applied to management approach. Another method is what we call the 360 degrees method, the full circle approach. And the full circle approach, as we all know, is about adopting a very comprehensive approach where you have regulatory compliance and risk and audit management. You have centralized management policies because you have a board or a specific committee that will overview the corporate policies, the incident managers, the surveys, internal audit assessment, and things like that. Okay, so comprehensive approach, centralized, because the only way to move forward, and that's all about this 360 degrees approach. And some of the key features to be looking into, I've listed them up. I'm not going to go down each of them because now it's becoming quite familiar. But you see, you have of course, you always have the legal and regulatory requirement, but you have incident investigation. You have, of course, data rooms, policy and procedure management are written out. Well, I'm not going to go into detail with all of it. You see, that's very extensive. That's why we call it a 360 degree approach. And finally, just to complete on that, so we can really start on something new tomorrow, the DMADV approach, which is designed for Six Sigma methodology. Here again, this is a private firm that is offering its own services. The DMADV, which is about defining, measuring, analyzing, and verifying approach. You have, if I'm correct, let me check. You have normally, I think you have an article that's on that. That's strange. Okay, I can't find. I'll check it out, and I'll post it if I don't know why it's not in documents. Okay, the design for Six Sigma is a process that is also used to manage projects. Okay, now with this approach that rests also on a backbone, on a computerized and data treatment backbone within CRM, within the company, you are actually able to set up compliance processes and measure those processes. Okay, we probably will not have time to look into that article, but I'll just make sure you have it. It would be interesting if you could try to look it up very quickly. No, okay, so I'll have to upload it because it's not there. Okay, so that's here again, and I'll finish on this. That's a solution, a compliance approach, very practically, in very practical terms, that is offered commercially by a firm. So you see how we were able to move away from general reasoning, the general framework, to precise commercial offers regarding compliance. What we'll be looking at now, okay, and if you have questions tomorrow, please do not hesitate. But what we'll be looking at from now on will be implementation of that, and we'll be looking at some compliance reports that are interesting. Examples. I have a set of examples that I want you to look at with you, because it illustrates how you go about implementing compliance within a firm and new compliance. In terms of cases, I want you to look at case 2, ethics and banking beyond compliance. We'll be looking at some of the issues. There are questions that are asked in the document. And then I want you to look at Kobe Steel and Kobe Steel and LG Electronics. Okay, because we'll start looking at that. So I want you to look in the documents at, wait, let me write this. So it's case 8. Deal to the Japanese company. Case 9. LG. Okay, and case 2. All right, so those are the cases I want you to look. We'll be looking at them together, and we'll also be looking at some of the ethics scenarios. But those are the cases I want you to look into very quickly. You don't have to read them in detail, but you should. Well, you can, of course. I'm not saying you cannot. You can, but you should try to look at them rapidly for the next sessions, because we'll be finishing on that. Applying some of the things we've talked about. I'll also be speaking a bit about corporate governance. Okay, I see time is up already. This went much quicker than I thought. I've updated the different presentation on the Canvas platform, so you have the last versions, the up-to-date versions of the slides, and even of other documents. I'll probably upload a couple of those later on today or tomorrow. All right, and if there are still no questions, since it's starting to be late in Vietnam, it's time to go out and have a drink. But unfortunately, I will not. Then I'll say good evening to all, and see you tomorrow.